Let's talk about some of the other things that you can do to increase your morning cortisol levels. We're actually going to emphasize two naturally occurring foods that have a significant impact on cortisol levels in the life of cortisol in your bloodstream by anywhere from 25 to 50%. If you're going to do that, you're going to need to be cautious about not spiking your cortisol too much, but licorice significantly boosts your cortisol levels. Let's talk about some of the other things that you can do to increase your morning cortisol levels. If you're starting to get the picture that cortisol is something that you want high early in the day and that you want tapering off later into the day, great, then you're getting the picture correctly. In fact, one way to think about it is that cortisol is kind of like a wave that starts on its own, but for which you can increase the height of that wave and catch that wave early in the day and into the afternoon. If you imagine it that way, then you're probably saying, what other things can I do besides viewing light, besides hydration, besides caffeine, besides exercise? And probably part of the reason you're asking is that not all of us are able to do all of those things every single day. I do acknowledge that. So the larger the toolkit of things that you can use to increase your morning cortisol peak, the more flexibility you have when trying to come up with those when traveling, when especially busy, and so on and so forth. So if we take a step back and ask ourselves what sorts of chemical compounds out there can help us increase our cortisol levels, we come up with some pretty interesting answers. And no, we're not going to talk about supplements. It is true that certain supplements like yohimbine, like L-tyrosine, can have a modest effect in increasing cortisol, but we're not going to emphasize those. We're actually going to emphasize two naturally occurring foods that have a significant impact on cortisol levels, both the amount of cortisol that you're capable of releasing early in the day and the duration for which that cortisol lasts. The first one is, of all things, grapefruit. Yes, grapefruit. Here I'm talking about the whole fruit. Could be pink grapefruit, could be not pink grapefruit, yellow grapefruit, could be grapefruit juice. And before I get into the mechanism and the protocol, I should emphasize that the effects of grapefruit on cortisol are not trivial. They're significant. So if you eat a grapefruit or you drink 6 to 8 ounces of grapefruit juice, it's going to have a meaningful impact on how long the cortisol that's already in your bloodstream lasts. The way it does that is grapefruit contains compounds that inhibit the enzymes that break down cortisol. In particular, compounds in grapefruit inhibit the action of an enzyme called CYP3A4 and maybe A5 as well. And that enzyme is responsible in large part for breaking down cortisol. It's not the only way that cortisol is broken down, but it's one of the major ways. And grapefruit has a significant impact in inhibiting the enzyme that breaks down cortisol. So believe it or not, many studies have been done in humans, men and women, and the net takeaway is the same in every case. If you were to eat a grapefruit, you're going to extend the life of cortisol in your bloodstream by anywhere from 25 to 50%, right? That's significant, and it has actually been shown to be clinically significant. And the reason I say clinically significant in this case is that indeed, there are some people that need to deliberately elevate their cortisol using medication. Those people typically are instructed not to eat grapefruit or drink grapefruit juice because then they're not going to get as clear a picture on how a given dose of their medication is impacting their cortisol. Likewise, people who have chronically elevated cortisol are told not to eat grapefruit or drink grapefruit juice because it can further elevate their cortisol. However, most people who don't have things like Cushing's disease or Addison's don't have to worry about this. And most people, probably you, are interested in having a lot more energy, get up and go early in the day. And you now know that elevating your morning cortisol is one way to do that. And many of you, presumably, don't always have time to exercise, or you don't always have time to get morning light. I know it sounds outrageous, but every once in a while you can't get sunlight or bright light into your eyes. Well, you might be thinking about ways that you could increase your cortisol under those conditions. Well, eating a grapefruit would do that, or drinking some grapefruit juice. And of course, you can eat a grapefruit or drink some grapefruit juice in combination with all the other things that we've discussed. In fact, there are compounds in grapefruit juice that will also extend the effectiveness of caffeine. So this effect of grapefruit on the various enzymes that break down things like caffeine and cortisol is a meaningful impact. It's not a trivial one. And so while it might seem kind of silly to say, oh yeah, eat grapefruit to increase your morning energy, it's actually a real thing that's separable from the effects of grapefruit on, say, blood sugar. That comes from the fructose in grapefruit, that comes from the vitamins and minerals and other things in grapefruit. There's a real and meaningful impact of grapefruit on the cortisol breakdown pathway. So if you're interested in boosting your morning cortisol, simply eat a grapefruit in the morning. I've started doing that late morning. I typically eat my first meal of the day somewhere around 10:30, 11 a.m. It sort of varies from day to day. I don't typically eat first thing upon waking. I do drink caffeine first thing upon waking if I'm going to exercise. Most other days I delay my caffeine a bit. In any case, in the last few weeks, as I've been researching this episode, I've started consuming one pink grapefruit, which I personally find delicious, late morning before my first meal. And indeed, I notice a tangible increase in energy both late morning and into the early afternoon. Yes, perhaps some of that is placebo effect because I anticipated this effect of grapefruit. But the data in the literature and the mechanistic pathway is very clear. Grapefruit extends the life of cortisol. The other food that can increase cortisol is licorice, in particular black licorice. We're not talking about red licorice, we're talking about black licorice. You might be thinking, what is this? Are we like getting into the realm of like really alternative medicine? No. All you have to do is look at the list of things that people who are trying to reduce their cortisol or who are taking medications to increase or decrease cortisol for a disease state are told not to eat, and you get an insight into just how powerful licorice is, or I should say things within licorice, are for increasing cortisol levels. What I'm talking about here is a compound called glycyrrhizin. Glycyrrhizin is in black licorice, and glycyrrhizin has been shown to have very big effects on increasing cortisol. So much so that if you are going to experiment with licorice or glycyrrhizin that comes from licorice root, you need to actually be pretty careful to not boost your cortisol levels too much. Start with the lowest possible dose of licorice root if you're going to use it in capsule form. If you're going to eat black licorice, a lot of people like black licorice. A lot of people are averse to black licorice. It's kind of a individual thing. If you're going to do that, you're going to need to be cautious about not spiking your cortisol too much, especially if you're eating it later in the day. We're not to late day cortisol control just yet, but licorice significantly boosts your cortisol levels. And it does so by inhibiting the enzyme 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, or 11-beta HSD for short. This is the enzyme that's involved in the conversion of cortisol to cortisone. So cortisol, when released into the blood, eventually is broken down into a bunch of other things. And in order to keep the cortisol active, and here we didn't get into a discussion about cortisol either being bound or free. Okay, the free form is the one that's active and can impact tissues, just like free testosterone can impact tissues as opposed to bound testosterone. Because it's also a steroid hormone, cortisol goes through some of the same regulation. The important point here is that licorice can be used to potently increase cortisol, not just the duration of cortisol's impact, but also apparently the release of cortisol. Now, the data on that are a little bit mixed. Some people would even argue that licorice can increase the synthesis of cortisol, but there's even less data. The data are very clear, however, that glycyrrhizin, which is prominently found in black licorice, you are going to increase the amount of cortisol circulating in your bloodstream. So if you're having a really difficult time boosting your cortisol in the morning, despite doing all the other things that I'm describing, or let's just say there's a day in which you can't exercise, you don't have access to bright light, you can't do all the things that you would need to in order to boost cortisol, but you want to, maybe that's the day that you try a small amount of licorice root or a small amount of black licorice. One very important point, licorice has a potent enough effect on cortisol, and cortisol has a potent enough effect on blood pressure that if you suffer from hypertension or high blood pressure, or if you are pregnant or breastfeeding, you absolutely do not want to eat black licorice. I don't know whether or not this is commonly told to women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, but when I looked in the literature, this was a repeated theme. Women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, people with elevated blood pressures should not be consuming black licorice. The glycyrrhizin is potentially hazardous for them or the fetus. So I say that in part to inform you about licorice and its effects on cortisol, but also that you be mindful that licorice has a potent effect on the cortisol pathways.